So let me first thank the organizer for having me, and also thank Lisa for her leadership in making Washington community stay current on all these important and exciting developments in Latin America. She's been doing a fantastic job, and I always appreciate her leadership and chances to work with you, with her. And so, understanding both the external and internal forces that are affecting the gas sector in Latin America could not be more timely in my perspective. When I say external, I'm thinking about how the gas is one of the fastest growing fuels. Like in 2018, last year, the global primary energy demand went up at the fastest rate since 2010. Within that, gas accounted for about 43%. And, also gas is getting the consumption itself globally went up by 5.3% last year. It's definitely a fuel that's getting more and more attention for many reasons, but one of which being, gas being one of the cleanest, if not the cleanest form of fossil fuel. And when I also say external, sort of factors being important, I'm definitely mindful that I'm at the, conference that's very much focused on, Latin America, but, certainly what's happening in the United States, matters quite a bit, to, other partners, countries on the continent. Last year, the U.S. Recorded the fastest growth in the gas export level, and perhaps Beth can talk more about it. But the 2018 gas production went up by 12% in the U.S. So it's not just the export level; it's the production. Obviously, it has been a very robust story. So in many ways, I think, the proximity of Latin American countries to this unprecedented event in the United States puts the region in this unique position to see whether, countries can sort of take advantage of it, seize, this, unprecedented opportunity. The other part is that, obviously, when you look at Latin America as a region, I think the sort of main story for quite some time has been more of an import story, as far as gas. But of course, there's, a few key, gas producing countries in the region. And there are so many pieces, domestic pieces and regional pieces coming together that could really unlock a stronger story for natural gas. But of course, there are also uncertainties, right? Whether political, regulatory, market issues. But for that reason, it's great now that we have this great panel. All the experts here will illuminate some of the key issues and developments in the countries that they tend to focus on. But then also for the entire region, Latin America, that should be better appreciated as we try to understand the role of natural gas in Latin America today, but then where it might be headed tomorrow. So let me make a quick introduction of the panelists. To my immediate right is Elizabeth Urbanas. She's the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Asia and the Americas with the Office of International Affairs at the U.S. Department of Energy. Thanks for your service, Beth. And to her right is Jeremy Martin. He is the Vice President for Energy and Sustainability with the Institute of the Americas. Great to see you, as always. And to his right, I guess yeah, it's David Goldwyn. He's the President of Goldwyn Global Strategies, very well-regarded, known figure in Washington. And then to his right is Antero Alvarado. He's the partner and regional director with Gasenergy. So without further ado, let me turn to Beth and give us her thoughts and her views on the nexus between, I guess, gas and Latin America.
Thanks, Jane, and thanks for thanking me for my service. I think that's the first time anyone has ever done that. I don't know what that says about me, though. Anyway, but most of you already know me, so So you probably know. I'm very happy to be back here again. I've been able to participate, I think, in all of these conversations that we've had in the past 3 years. And every year I come and I say, newsflash, that gas production and exports in the United States are at an all-time high. I know you're shocked by that. But as Jane highlighted, we are currently the largest producer in the United States of oil and gas, and we're the third largest LNG exporter in the world. And as we have said many times over, if all of the LNG facilities that are seeking licensing get built and actually export at the levels that is currently being projected, we will be at the size of Qatar as an exporter probably in a few years. So obviously, this is a vast change from the world before the beginning of 2016, when we were a gas importer and we were not exporting natural gas except for brief periods from Alaska, which started in the 50s, actually. So, obviously for the U.S., this is a game changer. And, not only is it a game changer domestically and has it been a boon to the economy and to some of the industry that's come back to the United States, and to, our ability to reduce our carbon dioxide emissions, and emissions in general. It's been an important element of that, obviously, and it has drastically changed things in the energy sector in the United States, but it also has drastically changed our relationship with our neighbors in the Western Hemisphere. Particularly those in Latin America, but also Canada. And I think one of the things that it has done, and one of the things that it can do, even as we continue to produce and we begin to hear about further production and export in countries like Brazil and Argentina, Colombia, all of those countries, most of which currently now import from the United States. I think we see it as a binding force for the hemisphere in terms of forming what we see as a hemispheric energy bloc that is more reliable, that is well supplied, and that can be innovative in its technologies and in the way that it sells and provides gas to the rest of the world that needs it. And I happen to have the luxury of covering not only Latin America, but also Asia. And so I see every day in my job and every day in my work the demand for natural resources, particularly gas, and also coal to some extent, in Asia, and the excitement with which they are looking for us to build a West Coast terminal, so that we can get some of the gas from the United States their way, bypassing the Panama Canal and reducing transportation costs and also risk. So, we really look in the department, particularly in my group, at the natural gas phenomenon from an international perspective as being one that can increase energy security globally. Not just in the hemisphere, which it's doing now. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about what's going on in the hemisphere, and also a little bit about the work that we're doing. And then I'll let all these guys, who I know you're hungry to hear, they're the real stars of the panel, let them talk a little bit more about the specific countries and things going on in different parts of Latin America in regard to development of gas and potential gas exports. So, I think as many people know, when gas in the United States was first developed, I can tell you the Japanese were here every day waiting for that first load of gas to Latin America. As a region, it is still the largest importer of U.S. LNG. So things have moderated a little bit, and we're selling more to Asia now. We're selling more to Europe, including how not only we get it out of the ground, but how we process it and how we are able to transport it and offload it to other countries. So real innovations that really started here in the U.S. And that DOE had a small part of very nimble, smaller amounts of resources to places like the Caribbean, which we haven't talked about yet today. But which is an important market for small-scale LNG, whether that's larger loads that are broken up and distributed, or ISO containers, which is a thriving business for the U.S., in which we've made efforts to ease the regulations on to make that easier. Going to places in the Caribbean and potentially smaller countries in Central America at some point that could utilize those loads. Also, there's a lot of potential for getting gas to isolated communities in the Amazon area, and other isolated areas in Latin America where you're looking to provide energy to indigenous populations or folks that you want to bring more into the modern energy spectrum. So a lot of potential. And obviously, as we've heard, Latin American countries are looking to diversify their fuel mix, not only to add LNG and gas to their mix. That's absolutely true. But I think what we heard from the last panel is that they're also looking to expand renewables. And they're looking to do it because it can be cost competitive. It has environmental benefits. And for distributed power in particular, it could help with geographically isolated societies. And so we really look to the complementarity of LNG and gas to be able to complement the movement away from what has been bunker fuels largely and other fuels that they're moving away from in Latin America or that they're ramping up to do that. The other area that we see LNG being really good to use with in addition to variable renewables is large hydro. And we touched on that a little bit in the last panel. Large hydro had been a mainstay in Latin America for decades. Biggest dams in the world, some of them, if they're not in China, they're in Latin America somewhere. And they have become, because of weather events, much less reliable as a source of power, and they can be difficult to maintain over long periods of time. And so one of the areas we see LNG, natural gas, being able to benefit these countries with is the variability of the hydropower. The other thing that we think is useful, and Venezuela is always a hot topic, but not always in this way, but as oil from Venezuela becomes less available, we see, particularly for countries in the Caribbean and Central Asia, gas is a good replacement source for generating electricity and moving away from the bunker fuels that they're currently getting. So those are some examples. I also want to highlight that we export enormous amounts of natural gas to Mexico. It seems like every other day there's a new pipeline. We heard a little bit about some of the problems with the most recent ones. But there are a lot of pipes that connect Texas and Mexico and other parts of the country too, New Mexico and Arizona. So I think we're going to see that increase, and we're going to see probably that continue as well. And then, of course, there's a possibility of exporting U.S. natural gas through our partner countries. So obviously, I think we'd all love it, particularly in DOE, if we were able to build a terminal in the United States on the West Coast. And obviously, there are options in California and Alaska in the North Slope. But there are also options through Canada, in British Columbia, and also at least two options that are pretty active right now, and the AES left, but they're involved in one of them, in the Baja Peninsula of Mexico, and also on the other side of the peninsula in Mexico. So lots of opportunities for us to work together, not only to export our gas, to increase energy security in our neighbors, but also for us to export together and to drive economic growth in both countries as a result of that and the jobs that that brings. So obviously, we heard earlier, and I won't get into it, Argentina and Brazil. I mean, Argentina, obviously, with their unprecedented development of unconventionals, Brazil with its enormous potential offshore in the pre-salt, Colombia with an interest in fracking, although, there are ups and downs in that process. We talked about that this morning. There's also potential in several other countries in Latin America, and eventually Mexico as well might be able to increase production. So, we are looking at being able to produce more gas as a Western Hemispheric unit. And as I said, I think it's very much the vision, certainly of the Department of Energy, that we could be a real alternative to other regions in the world in terms of provisions of natural gas in particular, because we have so much and we have such good geology in North America and Latin America as well. Just wanted to close quickly with just kind of a highlight of what we're actually doing. It's nice to hear me say highfalutin fun things about how important this is. But what we're doing is DOE, and we often work with the Department of State, ENR, with USAID. Some of the contractors are here today, with USTDA, with the Commerce Department. We have a number of whole of government approaches. We talked a little bit about America Cresse this morning, and that's a very good one that's looking economy-wide at trying to increase growth in Latin America. But underneath that, we're doing a number of things, specifically in energy. The Department of Energy is spearheading an interagency. It sounds like a horrible word, but but we are with other departments whom I just named. And OPIC and EXIM, spearheading a Brazil Energy Forum. So this is a new forum with our government and theirs. It's at the secretary level, and we are working on a lot of the issues you heard people bring up today. Lot of requests for us to work with them on creating incentives, both for the development and the midstream in gas and oil to some extent too. How to create the incentives, whether that's through regulations, incentive schemes. What have you done in the United States? The good news is we've done just about everything in the United States. Some of it works, some of it doesn't. And we have 17 national laboratories at the Department of Energy that study that stuff and build models and all sorts of interesting analytical tools that can help countries when they want to decide exactly what their energy mix is going to look like and how they're going to incentivize that. If you have a country that does that, we don't do that, but we can help others by looking at what we've done in the U.S. and analyzing what other countries have done. We also continue to have an active dialogue with Mexico through the U.S.-Mexico Energy Business Council, which is also with the Commerce Department. We should have another meeting in November. We had one this summer. And it is a way for us to work with the private sector in both Mexico and the United States to try to solve problems, address specific issues, and really try to increase the energy integration across border with Mexico, not just in oil and gas, but also in electricity and other areas. And then finally, we recently signed a U.S.-Colombia energy MOU, and we will be working on with them on looking at fracking. We'll also be looking at renewable energy and several other areas that were discussed in the last panel. So I would say that those are kind of the top programs. We have lots of other programs ongoing as well. But just to tell you, we try to put our actions where our mouth is, and we see a lot of potential hemispherically, and would like to see that grow.
Thanks, Beth. Now on to Jeremy, please.
Sure. Hello. There we go. Well, good afternoon. Thanks for sticking around after lunch. Thanks, Jane. Thanks to the dialogue. Lisa ran out. She knew I was going to thank her, so she got away from that one. Thanks for your service.
All right, that's enough.
Thanks for your service.
I got a little choked up when Jane did it. I don't know about you.
I don't blame you. So I was asked to talk about Argentina. I'll be very succinct. Nothing to worry about, no uncertainty, smooth sailing. Over to you, David. I'll put my glasses on now. And by the way, I heard a couple things this morning, which I'll use sort of the frame, some of the things I want to share. But I think it was Jason Fargo, if he's still around, he talked about a swinging pendulum. A swinging pendulum that I think he meant to say in the policy environment that swings back and forth. And then we heard, I think it was it Leonardo from AES who talked about this tug of war between state-oriented efforts and market-oriented, right? So if you think about the swinging pendulum, which is essentially this pendulum that swings back and forth between the role of the state in the sector, the role of the state in driving policy and in developing resources, and then, of course, the more market-oriented. And so that really is the preamble to my notes and conversation this afternoon on Argentina. And I think to do that, it's worth to go back a little bit in time because, as a matter of fact, Argentina, which is well known today for Vaca Muerta, actually is one of the pioneers in the world when it comes to utilization and development of natural gas. How many of you have been to Argentina and opened the back of a taxi and couldn't throw your suitcase in? Argentina has been using natural gas for vehicular transport for many, many years. The point I want to make is that in the 90s, they went through the whole deregulation and liberalization process and really created a booming natural gas market, a conventional natural gas market, which is one that then led to an excess capacity in their market, which led to exports to neighbors, which led to a huge advance in regional integration. So I'd suggest to you that their pioneering role in natural gas development, particularly in the Southern Cone, was also critical in their pioneering role in developing what was critical energy integration. Now, we had the economic crisis. That had a tremendous impact. And I think it was also in the last panel where we said, you can't distinguish or you can't separate economic backdrop from energy policy. And that's absolutely true. And so what you saw in Argentina, post-economic crisis and the arrival of the new government, the first Kirchner government, Mr. Kirchner, was an enormous swing of that pendulum to that state-oriented. And you saw through the original strains of the Kirchnerismo, which we can debate what that really means, an intervention in the energy sector, whether it was through policy or just changes in emergency measures and decrees that were put in place that radically affected the energy sector and led Argentina, which I had talked about becoming a surplus, an exporter of natural gas, to actually have an insufficient amount of gas to attend to their own market, let alone to export. And then that led to LNG import terminals. It led to more imports from their neighbors in Bolivia. It led to a whole host of things that I think are important just to understand as a context. This swinging pendulum, or at least the begin of a little bit of a swing back, started to change again when Vaca Muerta and the Unconventional Resources were discovered, set forth, the famous Energy Information Administration report that set forth Argentina as the world's second largest reserve holder of technically recoverable shale gas reserves, second only to China. That obviously shone an enormous spotlight on Argentina and once again on the gas opportunity. Now, it became an unconventional gas opportunity, and that's absolutely the case. Just sort of finalizing I want to get to where we are today with sort of this backdrop and context is what happened in the last couple of years of the Cristina Kirchner government. And I think it's important because I'm going to come back to this in the framework of what comes next or what could come next in Argentina. And so what I want to emphasize about the last couple of years of the Cristina Kirchner government, this is before Mauricio Macri, which we've heard a lot about today, was actually a huge effort. If you put aside the nationalization of YPF, it was a huge effort to kickstart and get the Vaca Muerta development off the ground. It was a huge effort, a state-oriented effort, you could argue, but a huge effort to get Argentina's Vaca Muerta unconventional resource play off the ground. And so you saw partnerships between YPF with Chevron, with Dow Chemical, among others. And so even in her personal memoir that came out recently, she touts her role, Cristina Kirchner touts her role in kickstarting this Vaca Muerta, this unconventional revolution in Argentina. Okay, so Mauricio Macri comes in and we talk about the pendulum, and folks have talked today, I think, on the power sector discussion about what happened more in terms of the power market. I think what's important to understand is when Mauricio Macri took office, all of these decisions and state interventions that had occurred under the previous couple of administrations had led to something on the order of a $6 billion energy trade deficit. You think that's sustainable? Not so much. I mean, this was a fundamental issue in the macroeconomic situation that Mauricio Macri had to address. How do you deal with a $6 billion, on average, energy trade deficit? Well, again, we looked at more market-oriented approach and a whole host of issues. In the natural gas market, it was focusing on reducing subsidies. I think we talked a little bit about the utility subsidy. There was a whole plan and an effort to reduce and drastically cut the amount of subsidies and the amount of money the government had to put into subsidizing energy, power and gas. The creation of a social tariff, gradual deregulation of the wholesale market, as well as something that's critical, and that was institutional normalization and normalizing the regulatory bodies and depoliticizing what had in effect been a completely broken system to regulate and basically make policy in Argentina. I'm speaking particularly about gas, but overall. So you once again went back to the 90s and the laws, which were still technically available in terms of their opportunity, to make NRGas be a true independent regulator and market referee. So I think it's important to emphasize that was, and on the other side, instead of subsidizing on the consumption side, one of the things they wanted to do to continue to jumpstart the unconventional production was to redo sort of the stimulus opportunity, the stimulus for production of natural gas at the unconventional level. And they created something called, or they went from Plan Gas, which was a previous administration's opportunity, to the Resolution 46, was directly targeted new development in the unconventional play and provided a subsidy on the upstream, to the upstream operators to hit certain targets for production of Vaca Muerta unconventional gas. we can get into a tangential discussion. I'll just say that Resolution 46 was perhaps a victim of its own success, so much so that there has been a huge back and forth with some of the upstream operators as to what the government should pay them, what the real targets are, what the assumed targets are. I'm sure there's some folks in this room in the audience, if you really want to know more how they feel about resolution, maybe you could talk about Resolution 46 as well. But anyway, the point is the effort to jumpstart and continue development of that world-class, that second in the world resource. And so it worked in a certain degree. So recent figures from NRGas shows that shale gas production increased threefold this year, up 87% year on year from June of last year to June this year. Total natural gas production almost 6%. The other thing is to understand the level of fracking that's going on. And so one of the things that they wanted to achieve in Argentina, and they kept using, the U.S. shale, and I'm sure you had many conversations, Beth, and you and your colleagues. How do we use Permian? How do we use U.S. shale benchmarking? And how do we get to that level of fracking and production? And so one of the things was obviously the number of frack jobs that are occurring. And so, again, from NRGas reports, the average number of monthly fracks since 2016, this is basically the Macri government, has increased by 181%, and with a peak of 712 fracks in February this year. I don't know how that compares to Permian. My guess is pretty close. So that, again, was one of the goals. And so whether it was Resolution 46, normalizing some of the institutional and regulatory environment, and of course trying to deal with the broader macroeconomic environment, this is what the Macri administration was trying to do. Well, interestingly enough, they have been successful enough with these efforts that they have resumed natural gas exports to Chile. So something that had been created back in the original sort of go-go years of the 90s is now back on a seasonal basis, and Argentina is once again exporting natural gas to Chile, which for most of us in that room, that's a pretty big deal, right? And if anyone is from Chile, that's a huge deal. I mean, how did you feel, when the gas was cut? This is a big deal. Now, the other thing is it has to do with LNG. So I talked about that energy trade deficit. A large part of that energy trade deficit was because of spot market purchases in LNG imports that Argentina was taking care of to meet their needs in most of those years of the Kirchner government. Well, guess what? Guess what happened in June this year? Argentina exported, not imported, exported LNG for the first time ever. And it was through a small-scale floating unit. You talked about some of the technological gains. It was through a small-scale unit. YPF commissioned a company for 10 years. And there's small amounts of LNG that Argentina, it's Vaca Muerta gas. Vaca Muerta gas is being exported via LNG from Argentina, from Bahia Blanca, the same place where they paid hundreds and hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars to import gas. So I would suggest a strong case could be made that the Macri government has been extremely successful in terms of boosting and facilitating the development of Vaca Muerta and its unconventional gas. But I think at the same token, what's very obvious that this has all been more or less lost against the backdrop of peso devaluation and just overall economic, distress of the country. So it's sort of, just you see all these numbers and you see the increases and you see the benchmarking against Permian and how they're retaining some of these, and yet against the economic and the macroeconomic situation, it doesn't really matter for the average citizen. And it's that sort of old axiom of James Carville. It's the economy, stupid. So the average citizen doesn't care how many frack jobs you're doing a month. They're in a soup line. So that's one issue. So, well, where are we today with Vaca Muerta as Argentina heads to the polls later this month? And I think a couple key things to understand is, despite all of those production increase numbers and all the things I talked about in terms of frack jobs, there's still only 4% of acreage that's under development, in development phase in Vaca Muerta. Only 4%. 73% has not even been concessioned. So there's an enormous amount of opportunity that still exists in Argentina in Vaca Muerta, whether to be concessioned or the other 20-some-odd% to be put in or brought into the development phase. There continues to be challenges such as the productivity and reducing production costs. That continues to be hugely important. Again, the benchmarking against some of the shale opportunities in the U.S. I think some of the government officials argue that they're there in terms of productivity and in cost. But I'm not sure if that's exactly the case. But it's hugely important because if Argentina wants to truly monetize Vaca Muerta, it's going to have to do major LNG exports. Not just a small-scale floating LNG, which YPF is doing today, but significant large-scale global LNG market exports. That's the way to monetize. And so the way they're going to do that is to continue to have to reduce their cost, when you talk about all the Gulf projects and all the opportunities coming out of the U.S., at this point in time, Argentina and the U.S. could become competitors in the global LNG marketplace. And especially like you talked about, if the U.S. through some partners is able to access the Asian market without hitting the Panama Canal. Infrastructure remains a huge element of that productivity and a cost equation in where it comes in terms of operations. OPIC approval of a pipeline. There is efforts in this government to increase infrastructure pipeline projects. The OPIC approval was, I think, well received on many levels by across the government there and in industry. I think we talked also, I think somebody used the old above ground, below ground discussion point. And I think, you know, again, Argentina seems to be exhibit A for so many of these discussion points. But the below ground, that subsurface geological opportunity in Argentina with Vaca Muerta doesn't change with the government, right? It just because a new government comes in, you still have that enormous resource. So I think those are it's going to continue to be the case. There are some other upsides that folks in Argentina like to point to in terms of why Vaca Muerta, even compared to some of the U.S. plays, is different. Less density in terms of population, more water availability, more access to water. The geography, topography is a little bit easier for development and access. So I think these are all things to keep in mind. Now, the fact I said that 4% of the acreage is in development could also perhaps speak to potential issues down the road when there is a much larger scale development that happens in those areas in the provinces, particularly Neuquén and Mendoza. So I'll end with just the crystal ball here, right? So I think, all right, raise your hand if you don't think Fernandez wins the election. Yeah, that was sort of a trick question. It's like a California proposition. Vote yes if no. All right, so nobody here thinks Mauricio Macri is going to win re-election. Not one brave soul. Okay, so let's go ahead because Fernandez will be the next administration. We don't know who their energy team is. We don't know a whole lot. But I think going back to some of the things I said makes me want to take a wait-and-see mode. And what I mean by that is Cristina Kirchner, she understands Vaca Muerta. She understands the potential. She's bragging about it, right? Now, how she approaches developing that is going to be a different question. There are some folks who are positive about some of the economists who are involved with her campaign and the Fernandez team. But the point of the matter is that I think we need to just be a little bit patient and see what happens. Again, will she take a different approach? That's probably the case. But I think the other thing to watch is the balance in perhaps the internal dynamic between the actual president, Fernandez, and the vice president, Fernandez. Because I think that's something we're going to want to see flesh out in policy and in policy developments. So I think the final point on this is there's going to be a pragmatic approach because there's no other way to do things. Argentina has as I said, a situation of economic distress is probably underselling it, under describing. There's a major economic crisis continues underway. There are very few levers in the economy that a Fernandez team or administration can pull. There is one that's called Vaca Muerta. This current administration's seeing about $4 to $5 billion of investment in Vaca Muerta. The estimates are it could go between 5 and 10 billion. Where else is a Fernandez administration going to be able to develop resources that give financial support to their incoming administration, to their new administration? So I would leave that with you that I think there could be, and again, this is a crystal ball here. So next year I can be, called out for being completely wrong. But I think a ownership of Vaca Muerta, a desire to continue to brag about Vaca Muerta, a fiscal need, a fiscal demand that the government will require Vaca Muerta to continue in development. But the final point is coming back to that tug of war, the swinging pendulum. How far back does it swing from the quote-unquote market-oriented principles of the Macri government? And how far does it go in terms of that tug-of-war between the role of the state and the market? So we'll have to wait and see.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Jeremy. And now to David. So tell us, what to look for as we try to better appreciate what's happening in Mexico's gas sector.
Sure. Thanks, Jane, and thanks to Lisa. It's always a great conversation here, and you always draw such a well-informed and engaging crowd. And Jeremy, it's great to be on a panel with you because you always bring that sunny California optimism with you, whether it's justified or not. So that's wonderful. And Jane and Beth and Antero, really great to be here too. Well, the two questions I was asked to answer are what policies has the AMLO administration put into place to reduce gas imports to the United States, and will they succeed? And the short answer to that is not very much, and no, it won't. So let me take a quick step back and talk about what's been happening in Mexico because it's relevant to the future of gas exports from the United States to Mexico and development in Mexico. So since the reform, it's been pretty volatile. The good news in Mexico is that the new administration has respected the oil contracts that in the previous rounds, that the retail sector, the distribution of gasoline has gone pretty well. And I think that's it on the good news side. On the more challenging side, they've suspended the oil auctions. They suspended the clean energy auctions. They have put in, can't really sugarcoat it, unqualified regulators to replace the technocrats who were in place before, and they personally harassed a couple out of office. So there are some real questions about the rule of law, the pushing of the Dos Bocas refinery. No private company wanted to make Pemex do it. Pemex's credit rating downgraded, the sovereign credit rating downgraded. And then we had this issue of the gas contracts. So for the uninitiated, CFE, using CFE's own contract, had tendered a number of contracts to have pipelines built to deliver gas. And as is typical in the industry, they were take-or-pay contracts. If the gas is not delivered, then CFE had to pay the shipper who would have been otherwise ready to ship. And for 5 of the pipelines, they didn't get built. And the government had to pay. And they had to pay because the government also defers to local communities in some respects as to whether they wish the pipeline to go through their community. And the government also protested the structure of the contracts, and then said they were going to send them to arbitration, which was, I think, an effective negotiating tool. So in the end, the contracts were restructured. And one of the major pipelines is now shipping, and the Framaca pipeline will also be operational, and 3 remain under local dispute. And so it's hard to tell what the takeaway is from there, which is either that the forces of economic reason, the rational actors, are saying we've got to be business friendly, let's get these problems fixed, or that the government remains a government of one, and it's the president, and Carlos Slim talked to the president and said, let's fix this, and they got it fixed. And the next issue will also depend on who gets to the president and what he has to say. So that's sort of the general operating environment. Back to the question that I was asked, which is the state of Mexico's imports of gas from the United States. They are at all-time highs, both the exports of LNG to Mexico and the export of gas. On the supply side, the Mexican government is putting about $1 billion into Pemex to, forgive the pronunciation, I think it's the Yachi offshore gas field, and to put more money into Chicontepec, which is a long-standing, unsuccessful, unconventional onshore oil field. So even if those efforts are successful, they will be negligible in terms of the supply of gas in Mexico. So what's Mexico doing on the supply side? Not very much. What's it doing on the demand side? Well, the number one thing which will increase demand is the operation first of the pipeline, the marine pipeline, and then the Framaca pipeline when it's built up. CFE is also planning on building another 5 combined cycle power plants. So the future of demand for gas in Mexico is really quite strong. And the open question now is whether the 3 remaining pipelines, which are all subject to some local disputes, whether those will get resolved or not. If the government decides to weigh in with the communities, as it has on one occasion, and say, these are pipelines we really think you should build, then they might get built. If he takes an agnostic position, then it'll leave it to the companies to resolve the disputes with the local communities. But under the reform, it's the job of the government to provide the right-of-way, not the companies. So essentially that leaves them in quite a vulnerable position. So is this going to succeed in reducing imports of gas from the United States? CNH doesn't think so. CNH has its own numbers out there. They are forecasting a 25% increase in gas imports by 2024, up to 6.74 BCF. 94% of Mexico's gas comes from the United States, and they're expecting those imports to grow significantly. So you have to ask the question, so if Mexico really wanted to reduce its dependency on the U.S., what would it do? They would have more bid rounds for exploring gas, onshore, offshore, or maybe it will get lucky and the operators will be unlucky and these fields will come up gas rather than coming up oil. But bid rounds would be the first thing you do. Joint ventures with private companies would be another thing you might do. Service contracts, which is what the government is pushing right now, probably not what you would do because they haven't worked before and there's not a lot of upside for companies, but that is in fact what they're doing. And you would develop the unconventionals. So you sort of wrap that all together, and the outlook for U.S. gas exports to Mexico is excellent because it'll be moving by pipe, it'll be moving by LNG. It's really cheap, and it might be hard, frankly, to make money doing unconventionals in Mexico with $2 gas coming out of the Permian because we'd rather give it away than flare it. So that's going to be tough. Is it possible the government will change its orientation on the supply side? Possibly. But to circle back to what does all this mean, we really can't tell, I think, at this point, whether the business environment has changed, whether the voices of economic reason have prevailed, or whether this was just kind of a lucky break to restructure contracts in a way that provided essentially probably no serious economic change to any of the parties. It was like it's like refinancing your mortgage, just lengthen the term and spread out the payments a little bit. So I think the long-term dependency of Mexico on U.S. gas is high. Hopefully we will continue to be a reliable supplier, but I think the prospects for change in Mexico are slim.
Thanks so much, David. Last but not least, Antero. So yeah, we'd be interested in hearing your perspectives, both on Venezuela and Colombia. In Venezuelan case, gas development efforts. On Colombia, I think to some extent more about, gas trade, or, import situation, if you will. That'd be great.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. Thanks, Lisa. I'm coming from Caracas. That's probably the last energy consultant based there, like the last of the Mohican, and but in some way that gives you some advantage. So, but in any case, it's very interesting to be here to share that kind of information. I lead Gasenergy office in Caracas, and I do cover also Trinidad, Colombia, Panama, and Venezuela. We also, I was a little bit interesting to see how Venezuelan topics is relevant in Washington, okay? From my side, we do track on a monthly basis production, and we do measure the impact of sanction. It's not the same to talk about sanction and to talk about people who are suffering sanction. I'm not talking about, nothing specific, but how sanction has been impacting not only the oil industry but the energy industry. Okay. I'm going to talk some about relevant key topics about Venezuela. Very fast. I'm not fluent. Sorry for my English. Venezuela has the 8th gas reserve in the world, the second largest in the conventional gas reserve in the Western Hemisphere. Another relevant topic is that we do flare 1.8 BCF daily. That's a lot. It's gas we export to the atmosphere. So we are a member of the OPEC gas. It's because we export gas to the atmosphere. It's like the Joker when he burns the money. It's like that, okay, in the film. And and why? Because it's associated gas. Historically, when the injection plants were expropriated, PDVSA was unable to reinject that gas, and then lack of investment. So they flare the gas. Okay, there's a lot of gas. This gas can be reinjected. And that happened 200 kilometers away from Trinidad and Tobago, who has a gas deficit of 1 BCF. So there's the hungry and the food. So it's very complicated dynamic regional dynamic in that part of the world. But again, I want to focus on gas flare because this is an environmental issue. There are programs to support to recover that gas, and also that when PDVSA are not able to reject that gas, reservoir lost energy. Most of those reservoirs are light crude oil that probably in the future won't produce what used to be producing in the past. They are damaged, pressure are below normal, and probably those oil fields where we used to see Mesa 30 and Santa Barbara 35, light crude oil, will be gas fields. Okay, so in some way I'm talking about, I'm 10 years, future, probably Venezuela will be more exported player or gas player than, not because we want it, it's because after the effect of what we see right now, probably Venezuela will change the energy matrix. Then another thing here is that we lost the demand. So power plants are running consuming half of the gas used to produce 2 years ago. Petrochemical plants are running, again, low demand. Reinjection, as I mentioned, they are consuming. What means is that there are a lot of gas available, but there's no market. Okay, so that's why they flare. This is mostly associated gas. On the other side, there are like 30 TCF of non-associated gas, which are located in the offshore, mostly on the border with Trinidad and Tobago, okay, where Chevron, Shell, BP are quite involved in the area, but also the Russian, okay, and then comes a little bit of a spice of geopolitical, interest, is because we see that Russians are becoming quite close to Trinidad and Tobago. It's because there's a gas interest. It's something like IOC majors are unable to bring that gas to Trinidad and Tobago, who need that gas to feed petrochemical usines and LNG. Okay, Train 1 of Atlantic LNG is about to be shut down. Okay, there is like a room for 300 million cubic feet available to feed Atlantic LNG at LNG facility who have half of the cost of production than the U.S. Okay, Trinidad and Tobago used to supply 70% of the South American market. Now that's start to change. So basically, Russian and Chinese are willing to get into Venezuelan side gas and bring it to and that's something that even if we are in a change of regime, that's not going to change. I mean, they are there, they want to fulfill agreement. How to deal with them? That's a very good question, not only in the gas side, but in the oil side. What are you going to do with Rosneft in Faja? What are you going to do with the Chinese in Faja? Okay. What will be the role of the US company? But that's not gas topics. Okay. And then the other topic is that we have a gas contract with Colombia. Okay. There is a pipeline. Colombia is a very interesting market because, in my view, they are struggling in a crossroad, deciding what to do, whether they go to the offshore, it's too deep, too expensive, too much available gas from the US, cheaper gas, okay? They have a LNG facility. The problem is that the structure of the gas market in Colombia is that they need gas when there are dry seasons, when there's the El Niño phenomenon. On that case, they can bring gas when they need. So they can sign long-term contracts and benefit from cheap gas. So the gas that's arriving to Colombia by LNG costs like $8, okay? And there are local players who are buying that gas in a spot basis and paying like $12 million BTU, okay? So in that case, and what we see is that it's becoming more regular that South Colombia is beginning to import expensive gas. There's a scarcity of gas in Colombia and it's pushing the price up. So in that case, Venezuelan gas is cost the half, like the Joker, when the Joker asks, why don't you kill Wagner? Never do it something for free, something like that. So the Joker asked, he wanted the half. Okay, well, the Venezuelan gas is the half. But to that comes some stream. Many things have to happen. Okay, there are sanctions, there are restrictions. There's a huge gas player in Venezuela trying to export gas with 10 TCF of gas on the ground. There's no market. We're struggling to getting paid, which is an important player, and there's a huge debt. So right now, this company will try to fulfill the contract of PDVSA. Many things could happen. But the thing is that Colombia could be benefiting in the future from the Venezuelan gas because Venezuelan gas could flow by pipe, not by LNG, okay? Well, I mentioned the TT situation. Trinidad and Tobago is also running out of gas. They're having gas curtailment since 2010. They are putting a lot of hope in Venezuelan gas, but it takes time, and probably Trinidadians are getting despair. I mean, they are very in a hurry situation. So Venezuelan gas can be competed by pipe, not by LNG. I'm not seeing Venezuela exporting LNG. Not probably I can be wrong, but it will take time, will take money, investment on their. I mean, we see there's gas everywhere. I mean, not only in the Western Hemisphere, in Africa, and everywhere. And apparently prices is coming to slow down. Japan restart nuclear plants. I mean, so you can be competitive. Venezuelan gas can be competitive if they export by pipe. Okay, but for the end, I mean, the main challenge in Venezuela is to create incentive. We are now struggling the transition. They are talking about create a new regulatory agency, but the regulatory agency wants to include gas, oil and gas, and probably oil and gas is not a good idea because, I mean, it's to come back to the story we had in the 90s where the gas was the Cinderella, okay? And sorry to talk always about films, but I mean, it helps to understand the situation. But in any case, it could be a very source of money in the very early stage of the recovery because there are infrastructure. That's something that is handled by private, okay? That's, it's not PDVSA. We're not talking that PDVSA will lead this project. But in any case, it could be a very interesting opportunity for Venezuela to, I mean, for the recovery and in the future. So thank you for.
Great. Thanks so much, Antero. My initial idea was to actually ask each one of you a quick sort of follow-up question, but in the interest of time, I do want to leave, enough time for, all of you in the audience, not necessarily all, every single one of you who might have questions. But so let me ask just two questions to the panel. Whoever has thoughts, feel free to jump in, but you can also take a pass. One of the questions, so a few of you mentioned sort of flaring and some of the environmental stuff, and Beth, you highlighted sort of the whole of the government or interagency effort to engage, many of the countries in Latin America. Where does some of the environmental issues fit in? In other words, there are a lot of lessons that are being learned as we learn more about, the methane emissions, some of the challenges associated with the use of gas, which has a lot of benefits. But so where does that sort of exchange of ideas, thoughts, lessons fit in your current engagement? And anyone else, if you have something to highlight, maybe at the, as a perspective as a consultant or, company-wide, there's, if you are aware of the robust discussion among the countries and service companies, that would be fantastic.
Okay, so I'll jump in first. I mean, we engage with various Latin American countries in actually a pretty wide variety of environmental issues related to energy. So obviously there are emissions. There are several nuclear countries in Latin America, and we deal with them in terms of how they are dealing with their fuel cycle, which is another very important environmental issue. We've done work and are looking to do more work with a number of countries in Latin America who are looking at water utilization, both in hydro and in thermal plants, as water becomes more of a pressing issue in the world, but also in Latin America. And obviously we've been working for a very long time with most of the large companies in Latin America on energy efficiency, which I think is an important, which we haven't really talked about, maybe a little bit in the last panel, but is a really important area. There is a lot of space, particularly as people move up in the income scales in these countries and buy things like air conditioners and appliances to really try to get at the demand side of that as well. And then we also do a lot of other efficiency work in more technical areas that also encourage reliability, whether that be through grids or other areas as well. So there's really quite a bit. The department does quite a bit of work actually on that because that's an issue that we're very much responsible for in some types of energy within the United States, and it's a skill set that we have.
And I just add, in almost every country, including ours, the question about whether gas is flared is a question of price and regulation. If there is a market price for the gas and someone can pay for it, then generally it won't be flared, it'll be captured. And the other is regulation, which is if there is no penalty or no limitation on how much gas you can flare until your takeaway capacity arrives, then you will probably keep flaring it, see Permian, or see Nigeria, or see Iraq. And if there is a penalty for it, and if there is an incentive to build that takeaway capacity, see North Dakota, then that gas will be captured and sold into a market. So my guess is Mexico might have some flaring for unassociated gas with oil. Colombia wouldn't dare; it's too precious down there, so it's not going to be a problem for them. And we'll see what happens to Guyana when it's their turn.
Two comments. One is when you talk about Mexico and gas flaring, I'm pretty sure it was the first thing that CNH ever did. Excuse me. The first thing CNH ever did was issue a report compelling Pemex to reduce gas flaring. Now, this was when CNH was basically a part of the Ministry of Energy, had no regulatory authority, no bite to their regulation. The only other thing I would add is, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think today Mexico has perhaps the most ambitious policy and implementation of policy when it comes to methane emissions, in at least in this hemisphere. I mean, it's currently where we are in the U.S. So,
If I may, just another quick question as everyone tries to formulate questions to the panel. I think, Jeremy, you're one of the first to actually say the term, the regional integration. I was curious as to how you see the pace of gas market integration for the region. For example, I was reading through the IEA's short-term forecast through 2024. The gas demand growth for Central and South America, that's how they, they kind of divide up the world, but it's like 1.2%. Certainly there are all these, gas wealthy countries, but I think the demand could be even higher, right? And I think some of you have touched on different elements, but sort of perhaps stepping back a little bit from the countries that you kind of just presented on, like how do you see the pace of, and I guess perhaps the current momentum for the regional gas market integration?
I'd say at the sub-regional level, you're going to see some integration. I think it's probably a mistake to think that we're going to have widespread integration. So certainly the United States and Canada, the United States and Mexico, very well integrated. We're close by. Trinidad's not well integrated with the rest of the region because it's selling its gas elsewhere. Chile and other, any LNG importer is going to buy where that gas is cheapest, not from its neighbor just because it's their neighbor. The Caribbean is, I think, where you see some prospects, and I think we're just, I know AES and New Fortress Energy are kind of the leaders there. You're just starting to see where, Jamaica has LNG imports where it might be able to move that gas someplace else. The Dominican Republic might be able to move it to a neighbor by these ISO containers or something else. The intermediary, the person who's going to do the milk train to go from country to country still doesn't really exist yet. There are companies out there, but the economics will change. So, but again, you're going to see that on one side of the Caribbean, but probably not on the other side of the Caribbean. So regional integration, I think, is probably too big of an ambition, but sub-regional integration, I think we're seeing episodically, but the biggest prospect for that is not going to be, I think, cross-border gas pipelines between countries, or sort of fixed LNG trade or an LNG buyers club. I think it really is going to be the Caribbean and the leveraging of these two new, LNG facilities to be able to move those smaller quantities to their neighbors. And then in those countries, into transportation, into hotels, into other areas.
Okay, now let me open up to the audience. So please raise your hand if you have a question or questions. Yes, and anyone else? I wanted to take in a bundle, but Doug, please. Yeah.
Doug Hengel with LNG Allies. For Jeremy, you mentioned that to monetize the Vaca Muerta resources, you're going to need large-scale LNG exports. By when does that need to happen, or you would be impacting investment output in the Vaca Muerta?
October 26th. That's a Saturday. October 27th, the election. That was a joke. That was a joke. I know it's getting late. I know it's getting late. I got a lot long. It's a long way off, but it needs to not be a long way off, if that makes sense, right? Because coming back to what's happening here in the U.S. Is enormous, and so Argentina is going to have to seize an opportunity, and there's the window on those kinds of opportunities. Everyone on this stage has seen them open and close. Bolivia had an opportunity to perhaps export LNG, hit the western coast of the U.S. when we were hoping to build import terminals. So I think the point is that the window is there. They have done a lot in terms of pricing at the wellhead and the moving up the chain in terms of production costs and what they can then do for competing. But the infrastructure, you have to solve the infrastructure. And that's going to cost a lot of money to solve the infrastructure. Now, with Cristina, I would suggest that's going to be led by YPF. And maybe it was going to be led by YPF anyway. But I think there's no doubt the primacy of YPF is going to be significant in this new administration. What's YPF's valuation? It's probably the same as what a major LNG export terminal costs to build. So who are the partners going to be? How many of them? I mean, there's just so many factors to that, right? So I'll say 2021.
I just wanted to jump in on Argentina with a little bit of a note of skepticism. I mean, I think Cristina, it does get credit. The floor price on gas really kicked off exploration because you were guaranteed to explore and get paid. But the three kind of canaries in the coal mine that I looked for was the return of capital controls, the return of basically a requirement for domestic supply, and the elimination of the floor price. They're all gone under Macri. We haven't even gotten to Cristina yet, and already we've seen capital controls, we've seen that price disappear. So it's all about the framework. I mean, the big next step in Argentina is the building of the evacuation infrastructure from the exploration areas to get it to the country and to get it out. I think who should build that is probably not an issue. Anybody that can make money exporting gas. But the signals are already there that it'll be a very challenging economic environment to get your money out and to get your gas out. So until there is certainty that that policy is going to change or what that framework is going to look like, I don't think anybody's going to be building anything. And I would think we're going to have a little bit of a cooling in the exploration side too, because, there's no point in producing it if you can't get it out and sell it. And it was a huge disappointment. I mean, I kind of understand it was desperation from Macri, but to see him do that, preemptively before it's gone, I think is, on the bright side, there's nowhere to go but up.
Yes, the gentleman here. And did you just raise your hand or yeah, okay. Yeah, you're the last person to get to ask questions.
Hi there, Francisco. My understanding is that the lack of LNG pipelines within Mexico, so beyond the border region, is one of the big choke points for expanding LNG throughout the country. But beyond the infrastructure, what do you see in the future for fracking in Mexico? And could you comment to some of the outcry, whether from the public or even officially from the administration, with regards to the environmental and also water challenges posed by expanding fracking throughout the country? Thank you.
Well, the president has said there will be no fracking. There was a plan for a pilot program. And after the pilot program was announced by Pemex, the president said again, there will be no fracking. So maybe the pilot gets through anyway. So that seems to be more ideological presidential opposition. With respect to local opposition, the prior government before they left, I think Aldo Flores probably led it, did some workshops out in the communities in Tamaulipas and other places to sort of explain this is how drilling works, this is how water protection works. There's even actually a provision in the reform that provides a derivation, I think it's up to 2% for the ejido or for the local community to earn something from it. So it's untested whether that kind of local opposition that we're seeing in Colombia, which 10 years of local excellent world-class consultation has not been able to resolve, will be successful in Mexico. But right now we don't even know how intense the local opposition is because you can't get past the president.
And I just want to jump in just to point out that Mexico is fracking existing wells. So, so there is some activity already. And so, obviously I think the unconventionals is a space where we've heard lots of different messages from AMLO and NALE, and sometimes they conflict, and sometimes they don't. And so we'll see about that. There's nothing unique there. But I would point out that, they are Pemex is looking at improving production in its existing wells, and its existing production, and that, that might be an option there as well for them. They have quite significant targets, I would note, too, so very ambitious. There's really no way for them to meet them, maybe, without doing that.
So, burning question? Yep. Lisa is up. Yeah, do we have a minute?
Hello, I am Leo Perez. I had the fantastic opportunity to work in the development and construction of AES Colon and the CCGT infrastructure, LNG, and all these capabilities that they are looking forward to expand in the region. So my question is for Elizabeth, to Elizabeth. Yes, I know that you will work together with other offices. And my worry is if you have worked with them and also with the multilaterals to try to convince, all these neighbor countries, because the thing is, if current or existing infrastructure with oil, if they want to convert to natural gas, if they don't have the PPAs, something bankable, this is never going to happen, even though it's very good for the environment. So I think that this combination with multilaterals and also the U.S. offices, I think they're very strong to unlock this value in the region.
So I will say that we do work with the Inter-American Development Bank here in Washington, and we have done actually quite a bit of work on LNG and looking at developing hubs and regional markets for LNG in the region, and we intend to continue to pursue that. They have very similar interests to us and to what you've expressed. There's a bigger issue of regional integration that includes electricity and other things too, which can be quite thorny. Not everybody gets along with their neighbors. That's shocking, I know. I guess Mexico and Canada and the United States are special. But, we do recognize that need. We'd be open to working with other multilateral regional development banks as well. We're also have been talking with OLADE, which is their statistical agency, a bit like the IEA, but for Latin America, about ways that we can expand cooperation with them. But I do worry, because when I go down to Brazil and they talk about where the pre-salt gas is going to go, and then you go to Argentina and they talk about where Vaca Muerta is going to go, there's a lot of this. And it's all going to Uruguay, by the way.
Can the Uruguayans know?
Yeah, but it's also going to the other one. So, I think it'll be an interesting thing to watch, but we do recognize the importance of that. We are watching it, and we think it would be very good. One thing we are thinking about is working with the regulators. So I think what you've heard a lot about in the conversation today is that the regulators in Latin America are dealing with this relatively new resource if you look at the amounts and exporting. And so there is an effort to try to work with them holistically, that we're thinking about pursuing so that we could share our experiences and how we have regulated and encouraged the development of gas, and how we share gas with our neighbors. We import gas from Canada, and so I think that's one avenue we're thinking about doing as well, and that's obviously something we could pursue with the multilaterals.
Okay, so thanks again for staying around for the gas panel, and also please join me in thanking this excellent panel of speakers.